In our last session, I talked about a biblical worldview, and I ended by saying that consistency is a very important thing for people who say they have a biblical worldview. And I raised the question, how can people be consistent and have a biblical worldview that remains constant as it should? And I brought up two words at that time. The first word was principle. The second word was pragmatism. And I said what we need are people who operate on principle versus those who operate on pragmatism. You need to have certain concepts that you live by in your worldview. I mean, I would go back again to the very beginning, your presuppositions, the grid through which you see everything in life. Okay, that is a worldview. Well, what principles fit into that from a Christian point of view? And I would say here's a way to kind of express it. If we take a dictionary definition of the word principle, here's kind of what we get. Principle is the source or origin of anything, first of all. It is a general truth from which one can deduce many subordinate truths. Now, I think that's extremely important to see that. A general truth, a concept that there's something out there that is bigger than just, what happens today or what needs to be done right now. There's a general truth that exists somewhere out there, but out of that general truth, other truths can be deduced. In other words, it's almost like mini truths coming out of the big truth, is really the way I would look at it. Principled people, what kind of people are we talking about? These are people who believe that there are such things as foundational truths. Now, it's not just enough just to believe that such things exist. You have to go one step further to be a principled person. You have to also desire to think and act consistently with those truths that you say exist and that you say that you believe in. Because a lot of people can say that they believe something, but what do their actions actually tell us? And finally, you must be willing sometimes to stand alone for the truth. There are times when it seems like the whole world around you may be going away from what is true. What are you going to do in that circumstance? What kind of worldview do you have? Is it a principled worldview is really the question that's being raised here. Now that's the side that I like to focus on, but we have to understand there's this other side too. And that is that whole issue of pragmatism. Now, pragmatism is good in one sense. You need to be a very pragmatic individual because it talks about things that work. You don't go to the top of a tall building and jump off just to see what happens. That's not very pragmatic. But when you turn pragmatism into a worldview, this is what comes out. You get to the point where truth, as it says here in this dictionary definition, truth is based on the usefulness of ideas. So whatever works is true. Now, again, you have to go back. How do you define usefulness? Everybody has a different concept of the word usefulness. And then what about whatever works? Well, what does it mean to have something work? My idea of having something working might be different from what somebody else says. And it goes on, truth is a process, therefore, if you're coming from a pragmatic point of view, it's constantly changing. It's according to the time, place, or personal experience. And so we do not have something that is with us throughout all time. For instance, take the Bible. Many people, those who are principled based upon biblical worldview say that it is good throughout all of time, no matter where you live and no matter what experiences you've come through. From a pragmatic point of view, that would not be the case. You would say, well, the Bible was written at an earlier time. That's not our time, so therefore it doesn't apply to us. You would say it was written in a different place and we live differently, and that's not applicable to us now. And our personal experience is a whole lot different from the people who actually were writing this book or who lived during that time period. So that's where pragmatism would be different from being principled. Pragmatic people then will be the opposite of what I've already explained with principle. They are people who don't believe there are foundational truths that are applicable to everyone at all times. And therefore, you do whatever is expedient to achieve your goals. So I'm going to emphasize the importance of principles. These principles, these general truths, are what we need to base all of our thinking upon, and not just our thinking, but our actions in life as well. So these general truths need to guide us. And there are some that keep in mind when contemplating a biblical worldview. What kind of principles? What kind of things should we keep in mind? Let's go through a few examples. Now, I'm going to give you what I think are certain examples of being principled. There might be others that I haven't thought of here, and other people might have a different idea of that as well. But I start with the idea as a principled position that God creates, sustains, and intervenes in His universe. Going back to that, as we talked about last time, the Hebrew view of history, the Hebrew perspective on worldview, God is the creator. Augustine, who we talked about last time, said that God is the sustainer, continuously holding things up, and God does intervene in the universe, would be a biblical way of looking at things. There's an interesting quote from C.S. Lewis before he became the C.S. Lewis that most of us know, because this comes down to before he was converted. And if you read in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, you will see what bothered him the most was that God that we just got done talking about, who is the creator, sustainer, and the one who intervenes in human affairs, especially that intervention part. The pre-conversion C.S. Lewis said the following. He said, "What mattered most of all was my deep-seated hatred of authority, my monstrous individualism, my lawlessness. No word in my vocabulary," he said, "expressed deeper hatred than the word interference. But Christianity placed at the center what then seemed to me a transcendental interferer," meaning, of course, God. Right? So he went on to say, "If its picture were true, then no sort of treaty with reality could ever be possible. There was no region, even in the innermost depth of one's soul, which one could surround with a barbed wire fence and guard with a notice that said, quote, 'no admittance.' And that was what I wanted. Some area, however small, of which I could say to all other beings, 'This is my business and mine only.'" So C.S. Lewis at that time in his life didn't want God telling him anything. He wanted to be able to just run his life the way he wanted to, whatever works for him. So you might say that he was a very pragmatic individual at that time and didn't really have the principles upon which to operate his life. I gave you before this book by Francis Schaeffer, a few things that he said in there. It's called How Should We Then Live? And in that book, he talks about, again, the way that God is involved with us. He says, going back to the time period of the Romans and so forth, he said, Christians not only had knowledge about the universe and mankind that people cannot find out by themselves, but they had absolute universal values by which to live and by which to judge the society and the political state in which they lived. Incidentally, that hasn't changed. We still have, as Christians, knowledge about the universe, and Christians believe in absolute universal values by which to judge a society and the political state in which we live. They had grounds, Schaeffer says, for the basic dignity and value of the individual as unique in being made in the image of God. So this whole image of God is a very important concept. Of course, what do we mean by that? As we delve further into this worldview, a principled worldview, we go to this, where man's choices are significant because we are made in the image of God. Now, the best way I can explain that is to start off with this idea that man being made in the image of God, the question comes up, what is that image? It has nothing to do with external things. I know that I don't look like God. So when we're talking about being made in the image of God, we're talking about the internal qualities, the ability to think, to feel, to choose. I mean, go through the scripture. Does God not have these qualities? Yes, he thinks, he feels, he chooses. We have been endowed with this ability as well, because God chose to give us that. His choices, man's choices, do impact history. It kind of depends what we do choose. Remember, obedience, disobedience, going back to the Old Testament, consequences follow the disobedience, blessings follow the obedience. So that is, again, a biblical worldview, a principled biblical worldview. I would also say, from my perspective at least, the individual is more important than forces. Because quite often we have people who are talking about what takes place in society and they say, well, it's just, you're kind of floating along in this river and the forces are taking you here and there. You don't really have much say in anything. I don't think that's really the principled biblical stance. From this perspective, I would say there needs to be a rejection of what we might call determinism. Marxists have something they call economic determinism, that everything happens as a result of economics. However, I would think that from a biblical standpoint, that's not true. Not everything that happens is necessarily God's will, because when sin happens, is that what God wanted? I don't think that we can honestly say that. Salvation is for the individual, Right? The relationship with God is not a group thing. We can't go and stand before the gates of heaven and say, well, I was part of this church and therefore I guess, everything's okay, right? That's not the way it works. God has an individual calling for each person. So the biblical perspective here on a worldview is that God is, transcendent in one sense, but at the same time very intimate. And He's made us to share what He is to a certain extent. We can choose, we can feel, we can think. We are called by Him to very specific things. So God interacts with His creation. I think we can also see that comes out of a principle here is that man is accountable to God. And when he's accountable for his individual actions and for the gifts that are given by God, the things that He gives us to say, now use this and use it properly. So this accountability is a very important part of understanding a principled view of a biblical worldview. Under the individual actions, there's the importance of personal responsibility. Now, it's very easy nowadays to blame society or to blame a system of some kind, whether it's the economic system or whatever it is, and to say that's why something happened. Or we can say, well, psychologically, we're conditioned by things around us. We just have to turn out the way that our environment, kind of pushes us. So we're determined by that. But I think from a biblical perspective, there is the importance of personal responsibility. We cannot do all this blaming thing. And for those gifts given by God, well, that's a concept that the Scripture calls stewardship. So what God has given us, it comes down to how are we going to use what He has given us. Continue on with a principled concept here. What about character? Does character matter? Well, I think in a biblical understanding, character is extremely important. History, government, everything that happens in our culture, character is significant. Personal character, a fundamental area of study for historians like me. We don't just look at systems, although some people might like to do that. We have to look at the individuals. We have to look at the system itself. How does this system operate with this individual in charge? How would it operate with this one? Because there can be a difference. Personal character makes a big difference. God tries, from this perspective, to lead men into what I would call self-government, where He doesn't have to stand, people standing over us all the time telling us what to do. Another word for it is maturity. That is very important in history. That is very important in culture as a whole. Right? And God's goal for nations then would be self-government. Now we know that not all nations are self-governing. There's totalitarian states. There's all kinds of problems throughout the world. But the goal, that's what is important here. So character is extremely significant as we talk about a biblical worldview and being principled people with a worldview. Right? Man is also meant to live in community. The development of unity leads to development of union. Did you know there's a difference between the words unity and union? Unity is an internal agreement about something. Union is the external coming together as a result of agreement. Now, if you try to force a union without that internal agreement, the voluntariness, that's very essential to that, you're going to end up with a very superficial, very ineffective kind of union, being held together by force. The Roman Empire at one point just kind of held together by the military and all the strictures that were laid out there. Accountability toward others also is a part of this living in community. Our brother's keeper, without negating individual responsibility. So both are important, your individual responsibility and your accountability toward other people. That's part of the individual responsibility also. Man does reap what he sows. Again, that's a biblical concept of reaping and sowing and reaping. Jesus had a whole parable about that. There is real cause and effect in history, in culture, in government, all these things. I say the word history quite often because that's my primary focus of study. Man's actions are to be studied to determine causes. Why did something happen? Now, we have different ways of explaining why things happen. Quite often, sometimes we reduce it a little too much and we say this one thing happened and that's what caused everything else. We got to be careful there because there's a lot of factors that go into things that have happened. But sometimes God is the direct cause and sometimes He uses men to bring judgment. We can see scriptures, Nebuchadnezzar over, taking Judea away into captivity. So these kind of things will happen. You got to be careful, though, not to say that that's what God did, unless you have absolute proof that's what God did. Right? We look for the seeds that give birth to the fruit, sowing, reaping. What was planted in a society, what is planted in an individual that gives birth to what comes out of that individual, to what comes out of that society, what shows up. What you see externally can probably be traced back to what's happening internally. And that's a very important point to make here. The internal is more important than the external. We're so focused on the outside. We're so focused on the superficial quite often. But what's going on inside of us? And that's what really determines what comes on the outside. How do I know this? Well, again, I can go to Scripture and I can look at things like this in Matthew 15:19, where Jesus said, "For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witnesses, slanders." Right? So it's the heart that gives birth to these things. Now, in society, we look at the external, and of course that's probably because we really can't see the heart. Only God can see the heart. But still, the point is, it does emanate from the heart. And that's why all these things eventually happen. One group that Jesus picked on quite a bit was the Pharisees. And at this point in Matthew 23, he said to them, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites," strong term to use, "for you clean the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside they are full of robbery and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and of the dish, so that the outside of it may become clean also." Okay? Internal versus external. And later in that chapter, he also talks about them being whitewashed tombs. They look good on the outside, but what's a tomb full of? Well, dead men's bones. So internal, more important than external, definitely. How to summarize this with principle and pragmatism? Okay? Pragmatism has led us to think more in terms of expediency than principle. People sacrifice principles to that which is less troublesome. Standing on principle can be wearying when no one else seems to care or understand what you're doing. Yet God calls on Christians to make His principles the foundation of all that they say and do. Going on with this, Christians get into trouble when they conform to the world's thinking and ignore principles. They are tempted not to cause waves, forgetting that the world already is a turbulent place and that men are seeking, whether they realize it or not, the stability of fixed eternal principles. And those principles can only come from a biblical worldview. Now, I spent the entire time this time talking about what I think the biblical worldview is, and the last session and this one. What I want to turn to next is the Greek and Roman worldview, where we see some things that are very different from what we have been talking about.